Montana Territory, 1883. The wind dragged dust across the cracked earth as Temperance Bell stood on the porch of the general store, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching the sun sink low behind the hills. Folks around town whispered she was too old for marriage now, a spinster at 31, but Temperance had grown used to the sting of it. She had her work, her small home on the edge of town, and the steady rhythm of days that never changed until he rode in. His horse kicked up gravel as he pulled to a stop. A man tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled at the ends. His hat was pulled low, but when he tipped it back, Temperance caught a glimpse of clear green eyes, steady and sure. "Madam," he said, voice warm like a fire on a cold night. "Name's Abram Calloway. I am looking for Doc Harridan. Heard he is the best man for a busted shoulder." Temperance blinked, thrown off by the suddenness of him. "Doc's out in the valley, fell off his horse himself." "You will have to wait until he gets back." Abram winced and shifted in his saddle, his left arm hung awkwardly at his side. "Then I reckon I will wait." He dismounted carefully, boots thudding on the hard ground. Temperance could not help but notice the way he gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to ask for help. There was something about that kind of quiet strength that stirred something deep in her. "Inside the store, Mrs. Caro," a woman who never missed a chance to gossip, leaned close to Temperance. "Poor man does not know better than to waste his time talking to you," she said under her breath. "Too old for marriage, that one." Temperance set her jaw and busied herself stacking canned peaches. She had heard it all before, she would hear it again. It did not matter. Except when Abram walked by her again, he paused. That steady green gaze found hers. "You own this place?" he asked. "No," she said. "I just work here," he nodded, thoughtful. "Seems to me you are the only one here working at all." Temperance did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But inside, something small and stubborn flickered awake. The next morning, Abram was still in town. He was sitting outside the livery, trying to mend his saddle with one hand. Temperance found herself walking that way without quite meaning to. "You are not going to fix it like that," she said, stopping a few feet from him. He grinned, a little sheepish. "No, madam, I reckon I am not." Without thinking too hard about it, she knelt beside him and took the leather into her hands, her fingers moving quick and sure. She had grown up fixing things. Her father had taught her before he died of fever when she was just 16. Abram watched her work, the quiet between them easy somehow. "Folks call me Temperance," she said after a minute. "Temperance," he repeated. "That is a mighty fine name, and you are Abram Calloway." "That is right." The way he said it, like he was glad she remembered, made her chest tighten strangely. They talked then, real conversation. He told her he had been a ranch hand most of his life, moving from place to place, never quite settling. No wife. No children, no place that felt like home. Temperance told him about her little cabin and the way she kept a garden in the back, how she sometimes sewed dresses for extra money. She did not tell him about the way loneliness sometimes gnawed at her in the long winter nights. She did not need to. Somehow she thought he already knew. Over the next few days, Abram stayed on. His shoulder mended slower than he liked, but he did not seem eager to leave. He would find reasons to cross paths with Temperance, buying nails he did not need, offering to help carry crates into the store, walking her home if the sun dipped too low. One evening, as they sat on her porch, sharing a pot of coffee, he said, "You know, back in Texas, folks used to say a man was lucky if he found a woman who knew her own mind." Temperance smiled a little. "Sounds like smart folks." He looked at her, long and serious. "You do not scare easy, do you?" "No," she said. "Life already tried to break me. I am still here." Abram reached out then, slow and careful, and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, warm. Temperance felt the weight of it deep in her bones. "I reckon you are the strongest woman I have ever met," he said. And for the first time in a long while, Temperance felt seen. Of course, not everyone was pleased, Mrs. Caro and her friends whispered louder now, clucking their tongues when Abram and Temperance walked side by side through town. Some men muttered about how Abram could do better, find someone younger, prettier. Temperance tried to ignore it. She had gotten good at that. But one afternoon, as they were leaving the store together, they crossed paths with Samuel Pike, a rancher who had once courted Temperance and then dropped her cruelly when she turned 27. He sneered at Abram. "You sure you know what you are getting yourself into, stranger?" "She is dried up like old leather." Temperance froze. Her cheeks burned hot with shame. Before she could say a word, Abram stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You speak to her like that again, you and me are going to have a real serious problem." Pike laughed and walked away, but Abram turned to her then, his face softening. "I do not care what they say," he said. "I see you, Temperance. You are not too old for anything." Her throat tightened. She looked at him, seeing the truth of it in his eyes, and something inside her cracked open. That night, under a sky flooded with stars, Abram stood outside her cabin, shifting his hat in his hands. "I know we have not known each other long," he said, voice thick with nerves, "but I reckon I know enough." Temperance stared at him, heart hammering. He took a breath. "Would you do me the honor of marrying me, Temperance?" The world seemed to still around them. The only sound was the wind in the cottonwoods. Tears burned in her eyes. She had thought love was something that had passed her by, like a train she had been too slow to catch. But here he was, offering it back to her, steady and sure. She stepped forward, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Yes, Abram Calloway, I will marry you." He let out a breath like he had been holding it forever, and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground. And for the first time in a long, long while, Temperance Bell knew she had found home. The morning after Temperance said yes, Abram borrowed a wagon from the livery and spent the better part of the day hauling lumber from the mill outside town. Word traveled fast, as it always did, and by the time he rolled the first beams off onto Temperance's land, a handful of townsfolk had gathered, pretending to mind their own business while casting sidelong glances. Temperance wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet him, her brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" Abram leaned against the wagon, one hand carefully bracing his still healing shoulder. "Figured we could use a bigger place. Something with enough room for whatever comes next." Temperance's throat tightened at the thought of it. She had lived alone so long, in a house barely bigger than a shed, she had forgotten what it might feel like to plan for a life that included someone else. "You don't have to do all this," she said, voice low. "I know I don't," Abram said, "but I want to." For a long moment she just stood there, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm quilt. Then she nodded once, sharp and sure. He grinned, the corner of his mouth lifting, and turned back to the wagon. By noon, he had set the foundation stones with the help of a young ranch hand named Elias, who owed Abram a favor from a card game. Temperance brought out cold well water and fresh biscuits, and they ate sitting on overturned crates, the sun pressing hard against their backs. "You ever think about having a stretch of land to run cattle?" Abram asked, brushing crumbs from his lap. Temperance looked out across the open plain behind her cabin, the grasses bending in the breeze. "I thought about it once. But it always seemed too big a thing for one person alone." "Well," Abram said, picking up his hammer again, "you're not alone anymore." That night, after the rest of town had retreated to their own suppers and beds, Abram stayed to stack the last of the planks under the eaves. Temperance lit the lantern on her porch, the golden glow spilling across the dirt yard. "You should stay for supper," she said, smoothing her skirts with a nervous hand. Abram set down the boards and wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. "I'd like nothing better." Inside, she stirred a pot of venison stew, the scent filling the small kitchen. Abram sat at the table, his boots planted wide, watching her with a kind of quiet reverence that made her hands tremble if she thought about it too hard. "You ever think you'd settle down?" she asked, not looking at him. "Didn't think I'd find a place worth settling for," he said. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls and set them down, the wood of the table worn smooth by years of use. For a while they ate in silence, the clink of spoons the only sound. Then he said, "When we get that house built, I want to fill it with all the things you ever wanted but didn't have." Temperance blinked, caught off guard. "Things don't matter much to me, I know," he said. "That's why you deserve them." After they finished, Abram stood and took the bowls to the washbasin without being asked. Temperance watched him, the simple kindness of the act stealing her breath more than any grand gesture ever could. Later, they sat on the porch again, the stars thick enough to feel like a ceiling overhead. Abram's hand found hers, rough fingers twining with hers in a grip that spoke of promises without needing words. "You got anyone you want to send word to?" he asked. "Family?" Temperance shook her head slowly. "My parents passed years ago, no brothers or sisters, just me." Abram nodded, his thumb tracing slow circles against her knuckles. "Then we'll make our own family." The words settled in her chest, solid and right. A few days later, the preacher rode in from the next town over, a wiry man with a weathered Bible tucked under his arm. Temperance wore her best dress, a simple blue calico that had grown soft from washing. Abram had cleaned up as well as he could, the stubble on his jaw trimmed neat, his boots polished. They stood together under the cottonwood tree behind her cabin, the branches heavy with early summer leaves. No grand crowd, no music, just the two of them, the preacher and the wind sifting through the grass. As the preacher spoke, Temperance kept her eyes on Abram's face, memorizing every line and shadow. When it came time to say "I do," her voice did not waver. When it was done, Abram leaned down and kissed her with a gentleness that belied the strength in his frame, his hand cradling her cheek like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. They shared a simple meal afterward, just the two of them, sitting on the porch steps and watching the sun disappear behind the hills. Abram reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched in flight. "Made this for you," he said, pressing it into her hand. Temperance turned it over carefully, the smooth wood warm from his touch. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. That night they lay together in the small cabin, the narrow bed barely enough for two. Abram tucked her against his chest, his arm heavy around her waist. As she drifted toward sleep, Temperance thought of the house they would build, the land they would tend, the future they would carve out of the stubborn earth together. For the first time in her life, the dark did not feel lonely. It felt like home. The new house rose slow and steady, each beam and board set with care. By late summer, the walls stood upright, the roof framed out against the pale Montana sky. Abram handled what heavy work his shoulder allowed, while Temperance, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hammered nails and measured planks with a precision that made the old carpenter from town mutter approval under his breath. One afternoon, while Abram was fitting the door jamb, Temperance leaned against the shaded side of the house, sipping cool water from a tin cup. Abram wiped his hands on his jeans and crossed the yard to her, his face shaded beneath the brim of his hat. "Been thinking," he said. Temperance arched an eyebrow. "We ought to put in a smokehouse," he said. "Come winter, it'd be good to have meat set back." Temperance tapped the rim of her cup thoughtfully. "We could dig a root cellar too, keep potatoes and apples from freezing." Abram nodded. "A place like this needs a proper larder." She hesitated, then said, "You ever built a smokehouse before?" "No," he admitted, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I figure we can figure it out same as anything else." Temperance smiled, a real one that reached her eyes. The idea of building something lasting, stone by stone, filled her chest with a quiet sense of rightness she had never known before. Later that week, a letter arrived from Abram's younger brother who ran cattle down near Cheyenne. Abram unfolded it by the light of the lantern, squinting at the neat, careful handwriting. "Samuel's offering us 2 yearlings come spring," he said, passing the letter to Temperance. "Says they'll be ours free and clear if we want them." Temperance traced the ink with one finger. 2 cows can turn into a whole herd if we're patient enough." "That's the idea," Abram said, a warmth in his voice she hadn't heard before. They sat close that night, the cool air creeping through the chinks in the cabin walls. Abram reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Temperance's ear, his touch lingering, feather light. "You think you'll be happy here?" he asked, voice rough with something he wasn't quite naming. Temperance looked around the small room, the familiar battered stove, the battered table, the narrow bed they shared. She thought of the new house rising against the sky. She thought of smoke curling from a proper chimney, of shelves lined with jars of preserves, of calves bawling in the spring grass. "I already am," she said. In the weeks that followed, Abram taught her how to ride astride instead of side saddle so she could help run cattle when the time came. At first, Temperance balked stiff and awkward in the saddle, but Abram's patience never wavered. "You're holding your breath," he said once, riding alongside her on his chestnut mare. "That's why you can't keep your seat." Temperance huffed, scowling. "I'm not." "You are," he said, laughter rumbling low in his chest. "Breathe, Temperance. Horse can feel every bit of you, even what you're thinking." She forced herself to exhale, felt the tension ease from her shoulders, and for the first time the gelding beneath her moved with her instead of against her. "Better," Abram said, and the pride in his voice made her sit a little taller. As September settled in, the air crisped at the edges. Nights grew colder, mornings misted over with frost. Abram finished the last of the roofing just days before the first snowfall dusted the higher peaks. On a clear afternoon, they moved into the new house. It smelled of fresh cut wood and the earthy scent of clay packed between the logs. Temperance carried in a battered quilt her mother had made, spreading it over their new wide bed, while Abram hung their wedding portrait, a simple daguerreotype taken by a traveling photographer, above the hearth. They stood together in the middle of the room, the fire crackling low behind them, the light catching the worn lines of their faces. Abram reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "This is ours now," he said, his voice low and sure. Temperance squeezed his hand back. "It's more than I ever dared hope for." Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long purple shadows across the fields. Abram pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Whatever comes," he whispered, "we'll face it together." Temperance closed her eyes and breathed him in wood smoke, leather, the clean scent of the open air. She believed him with every fiber of her being. That night, they fell asleep to the howl of coyotes in the distance and the steady thrum of each other's hearts. By late October, the mornings came with a brittle chill that clung to the grass until midday. Temperance rose early, as she always had, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders before stepping into the kitchen to stir the fire back to life. Abram had already gone out to check the fencing along the southern edge of their land, leaving his coffee cup rinsed clean and set upside down by the basin. She set a pot of beans to simmer and worked through the morning with the easy rhythm that had settled between them since the move. When the sun climbed higher, she carried a basket of sewing out onto the porch, settling into the rocking chair Abram had built from hickory and rawhide strips. The sound of hooves stirred the air long before she saw him. Abram rode up at a steady pace, tipping his hat back as he swung down from the saddle. His coat was dusted white where the frost had brushed against the brush he had ridden through. He tied the gelding to the hitching post and crossed to her, his boots leaving sharp prints in the hard earth. "Fence held through the storm," he said, resting a hand against the porch post. "But I found wolf tracks near the creek." Temperance set her needle aside, frowning. "Close to the stock, too close for comfort," he said. "We might need to put up a few traps." She nodded, considering. "I can help bait them. Wolves are smart. It'll take both of us." Abram's mouth curved into a slow, fond smile. Wouldn't have it any other way. As the afternoon wore on, they worked side by side, setting iron traps near the narrow paths where the wolves had moved. Temperance crouched low, her skirts tucked up out of the way, her hands steady as she laid fresh venison scraps in the traps. Abram kept watch, rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning the ridge lines. When the last trap was set, he reached down and pulled her to her feet, their hands dusted with soil and cold. "You ever seen a wolf up close?" he asked. "Only once," she said. "When I was a girl, it stood at the edge of the woods just watching, never so much as growled." "Fierce and proud," Abram said, his thumb brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. "Like someone else I know." Temperance laughed, low and surprised, the sound pulling a matching glint from his eyes. As the sun lowered, they walked back toward the house together, the first stars beginning to blink into the pale sky. At the porch, Abram caught her hand, his touch careful, as though he still marveled at being allowed to hold her. "I was thinking," he said, voice roughened by the cold, "we should build a smoke shed before the ground freezes hard." Temperance tilted her head, studying him. "You planning to do all that work yourself?" A flash of humor lit his face. "With you by my side, I figure I can do most anything." She squeezed his hand, the gesture brief but firm. "Then we best get started tomorrow." That night, Temperance curled against him beneath the quilt, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the coyotes called again, but the sound no longer carried any loneliness. It filled her instead with a sense of belonging, as if even the wild creatures knew this land was claimed now, stitched together by two stubborn souls who had chosen each other when no one else had thought it possible. When morning came, they rose together, ready to build the life they had promised with their own two hands. The autumn wore itself thin, and with winter pressing close, Temperance and Abram finished the smokehouse in a rush of short, brittle days. They hung strips of venison and salted pork inside, the air turning rich and heavy with the smell of curing meat. Most of the town had tucked in for the season, smoke rising steady from chimneys, and the streets grew quiet under the gray sky. One afternoon, Abram returned from the creek carrying a bundle wrapped in burlap. He set it on the table without a word and unwrapped it with careful fingers. Inside lay a half-frozen sheaf of wild onions, their long stalks pale and sweet-smelling. Temperance brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Where'd you find those?" "Down near the water," he said. "Figured they'd do better in our root cellar than left for the deer." She gathered them up and arranged them in baskets to dry, the simple abundance filling her with a quiet satisfaction. Abram leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a look she had come to know well, steady, full of something deeper than words. Later, as the first snow began to fall, they sat by the fire, Abram sanding a rough-hewn cradle he had started carving from pine. Temperance stitched a heavy woolen blanket, her needle flashing in the firelight. Abram set his work down and stretched his legs toward the hearth. "I've been thinking on spring," he said. Temperance set her sewing aside and turned toward him. "What about it? We'll need to fence more pasture if we're planning to take Samuel's yearlings." She nodded, feeling the weight and sweetness of it. "I still have a small bit of my father's savings, enough to buy more wire." Abram's eyes warmed. "You've been holding that money all these years." "I was saving it for when I wasn't alone anymore." He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her, his hand closing around hers. "You're not alone, Temperance. Not now, not ever again." She leaned her forehead against his, feeling the solidness of him, the certainty. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the world to silence, as if giving them a moment carved out of time itself. The next morning, Abram shoveled a path to the barn while Temperance tended to the chickens, their feathers fluffed against the cold. She scattered cracked corn, smiling as they clucked and scratched at the frozen ground. By midday, Abram returned with a battered iron stove he had traded for at the blacksmith's. Together, they heaved it into the smokehouse, where it would keep the meat from freezing too hard once the deep cold set in. That evening, Abram poured 2 mugs of cider, the warmth of it seeping into their hands as they sat before the fire. "I never thought I'd find this," Abram said, gazing into the flames. Temperance sipped her cider thoughtfully. "Find what? This kind of life. A place that feels like it's mine. A woman who makes it more than just a piece of land." Temperance set her mug down and reached for him, pulling him close. I spent a long time convincing myself I didn't need anyone, she said. But the truth is, life's better with someone beside you. He kissed her then, slow and lingering, the kind of kiss that spoke of every silent promise they had made. Winter deepened, and the days shortened. They fell into a rhythm of shared work and quiet evenings. Temperance mended clothes by the fire. Abram whittled small toys from scraps of wood. They read old books Temperance had collected over the years, their voices low in the lamplight. One night, after a heavy snowfall, Abram returned from the barn with a sparkle in his eyes. "There's something you ought to see," he said, holding out his hand. Temperance slipped into her cloak and boots, and together they trudged through the deep snow. At the edge of the field, the moonlight caught on something dark and moving. Two young calves, huddled together against the cold, their breath misting in the air. "They wandered down from the hills," Abram said. "Must have gotten separated from their herd." Temperance knelt in the snow, her hand outstretched. One of the calves stepped closer, its big eyes wary but curious. "We'll keep them," she said firmly. "Raise them ourselves." Abram grinned, his teeth flashing white in the dark. "That's what I hoped you'd say." They guided the calves back to the barn, bedding them down in fresh straw. As they stood watching the small creatures settle, Abram wrapped an arm around Temperance's shoulders. "Feels like a beginning," he murmured. She leaned against him, her heart full to bursting. "It is." In the weeks that followed, they built a pen near the barn and taught the calves to feed from buckets. The work was hard and cold, but it stitched them even closer together. Every small success, the calves taking grain, the smokehouse staying warm enough, felt like a thread woven into the fabric of their life. By March, the snow began to melt, revealing the hard ground beneath. The river swelled with runoff, and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. Temperance planted early onions and hardy greens, her hands black with soil. Abram helping her turn the beds. One evening, as the sky blushed pink with sunset, Abram pulled Temperance close on the porch steps. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "Once we get the herd growing and the fields planted, maybe we could think about filling that cradle." Temperance stared at him, her breath catching. She had long tucked that hope away, buried it deep. But here, with Abram's arms around her and the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, it didn't seem so impossible. "I'd like that," she whispered. He kissed her temple, lingering there. As spring unfurled itself across the land, Temperance and Abram built their life piece by piece. The calves grew strong, the fields greened, and the smokehouse stood firm against the last biting winds. Temperance often found herself pausing during the day, watching the way Abram moved across the yard, his steps sure and easy. She would smile to herself, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. And when the nights cooled and the stars spilled overhead, they would sit together on the porch, the quiet hum of crickets around them, the future stretching out wide and welcoming. In the years that followed, they raised cattle and crops, a family and a home. Their love, forged through hardship and built with steady hands, never wavered. It grew deep and enduring, rooted as firmly in the Montana soil as the cottonwoods along the creek. Through every season, every trial and triumph, Temperance and Abram faced the world side by side, hearts bound together by a life they had chosen and built with their own stubborn, hopeful hands.